Cool. Right, you were recording.
All right, let's let me find the presentation. All right, where's the play button? All right, everybody can see? I don't even have chat open, so I hope that was a yes. All right. All right, welcome everybody to the MCSS personal website workshop. I'm Aaron, and along with Sean, I'm one of the co-directors of technology of the MCSS this year, a personal website enthusiast, and I am excited to help you guys start your journey or continue on your journey towards making a personal website that you actually like and want to have on the internet. All right, so here's a little bit of about what we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to talk about why you might want to have a personal site. We're going to talk about what technologies we recommend you use, and we're going to walk through and motivate why we've picked these in particular. They're not just random choices. We're going to talk a little bit about web design principles in general, and also specifically when things you want to consider when working on your personal site. Sean is going to do a live coding demo showing you how to get up and going with a React Next project. And then we're going to show you how to deploy your website on the internet for free if you use these tools. All right, so first, why do you need a personal site? Why might you want one? So first and foremost, I think everybody thinks of a personal site as something of a portfolio that you can send to potential employers. I link mine on my resume, and I gotta say, I've been applying for some jobs and internships over the past months, and I actually have Google Analytics set up on my website so that I can see what kind of engagement I'm getting from how many people, how many new and returning users, where they are, what they're looking at, for how long. And I send my website, my resume in my website, and I look at the analytics, and I actually see people from, if I apply to a job in Mountain View, California, I see people in Mountain View, California looking at my website. So it gives me a good indication of what they're looking at and if they're looking. So people actually do look. It's a great place to host any kind of project, whether it's something for a CS project that you did, some code that you wrote. I know people who have their YouTube videos, their music, their art, their photos, a blog, anything that you work on that you want to show to the world. Personal website's a great place for that. It's a great way to start with or to practice your web development skills. It's a project that you can do as many iterations on as you want. It's very low stakes. There's no timeline. You can use whatever technology you want. So it's a great way to practice web dev. You could put your resume on your resume. Normally, if you have a Word document as your resume, it's not that impressive. But if you have a resume and a personal website, you can actually use that personal website as a project on your resume and say to people, hey, look, I wrote my own personal website. It's totally a project, and you should advertise it as such. And then there's the clout. Everybody who has a personal website is immediately cooler than people who don't have personal websites. And as STEM people, we really love looking at other people's projects and personal websites and then judging them and ourselves based on that. So I highly recommend having a great presence on the web. All right, so here are some core principles that I think are very important for a personal site. First, it should be easy to use. There should be zero learning curve to your website. This is mostly a way to display information to somebody who might be interested. So there needs to be fairly little interactivity, and there should be very little guessing on how to use your website. It should be really easily skimmable. And we'll get into a little bit about how you can do this later, but especially for recruiters, they look through your resume and your website very, very quickly. It should be easy to navigate, not a lot of back and forth that they're going to have to do. And all the information that's very important should just jump right out of them, should be immediately available. It should be consistent. A professional looking site is a consistent looking site. And when I say professional, I don't mean that it has to be sterile or uninspired or just look like a website. It can look like whatever you want, but you do have to have a consistent design language to make it look like it was developed by somebody who understands what a good website looks like. It should be fast. You don't want somebody going to your website and having a loading spinner forever in the bar of their web browser with a blank page, waiting for your JS to compile or your website to be pulled down from a server, et cetera. Especially for recruiters, again, it's a really bad sign if they can't get onto it because they have very little time to look at your stuff. Plus, it should show off your coding acumen. And then it should be yours. There's a lot of inspiration that you can get from looking at a lot of other personal websites, and it's okay and encouraged for you to take things, elements that you think are great from a personal website and use it in your own. However, it should reflect you as a person, get the message that you want across and look like yours. All right, so let's talk about the technologies that we have decided are most useful. So we are big fans of React for this purpose. React is a framework built using JavaScript to make front-end applications. It's very declarative. So you write essentially a line for a component, and that component has exactly the functionality that you describe in the code. It's very easy to combine the content, structure, and logic of your website into a very consistent and readable format. It also allows you to create reusable components that will lend themselves to the consistency that we were talking about earlier. Using these components over and over again in as many places as possible makes your website look efficient. It reduces the amount of code that you have to write, the amount of code that you have to maintain, and the amount of code that the browser has to load when people go to your website. So reusability is very important when you're developing on the web. React is also a very hireable skill. Working on a low leverage project like a personal website in React is a great way to get started. So React does definitely assume knowledge in JS, but JS is very similar to a lot of other programming languages. And as you will see, React really has its own syntax, and you spend much more time learning the way that React works and its fundamentals rather than the JS of it all. Like I was saying, React is very hireable. A lot of people, especially who are hiring for front end, want React, and it's a great way to jump in. However, it is slow with an asterisk. And the reason there's an asterisk there is React is slow for the kind of application that we're going to be building today, but there is a fix. And that fix, I will explain after I got the slide order wrong. I will explain why it's slow, and then I'll explain the fix. All right. So why is React slow for a personal site? Well, a personal site is a small, highly static website, meaning that the content doesn't change much from load to load, or not at all. So when a client goes to a React site, they will start by sending a request to the cloud, to the server. The cloud will respond with essentially two kinds of documents. An HTML document, which in a React app, in a standard React app, is essentially empty. It's just a blank template that HTML can be injected into. And a JavaScript file that has your entire React app inside of it, or a JavaScript bundle rather. Then what happens is your browser will run that JavaScript, which will generate HTML and CSS that your browser can read. And after all of that is generated, the browser can display the generated HTML. So most of the work is actually done on the client computer because React assumes that we don't know what's going to be put into your templates yet. However, for a personal site, we know up front. So we use Next.js to offload the work to the server. This is called static site generation. We use a dynamic website framework like React and Next in order to create a static website as though it were just HTML and CSS. So we get the modern benefits and flexibility of React without having to deal with the loading times on the client. So when we deploy our site, the static files, the HTML, are generated at deploy or build time, one time. Then those files are hosted on the server. And when a client goes to your website, rather than pulling down a ton of React and building the website on their computer, they pull down the pre-built HTML, CSS, and smaller JavaScript files to their client and it loads much faster. And this approach works for any website as long as the user's interactions do not affect the content much. So for a website like Facebook, where you're making a post and on the website and the data on the server and what is displayed on the website change very frequently depending on new data that's getting pulled down and what the user is doing to interact. However, since the data does not change much on a personal website, and we only need to change it when we build the website, we can use this approach. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, so we will talk about deployment. You can deploy this for 100% free because it's very, very light to deploy. And we'll talk about that a little later. All right, so here's some design principles to keep in mind. So specifically when we're talking about a personal site, scrolling is better than navigating. And this tip was given to me by a former boss and mentor of mine, who is the CTO of a large tech company. And he says that when he's reviewing websites, he does not like clicking around because there's a lot of loading, a lot of unloading, and it's not really the way that people are used to reading things like documents and resumes. It is much easier to scroll and find the most key information rather than jumping across to a lot of different pages. You don't want to hide content. I see a lot of people making websites where they will have little cards, and those cards have the name of a project on the front, and you hover over that card, and all the info on the project is on the back. And this is bad for a few reasons. First of all, a user might not know to look there. Second of all, there's no such thing as hovering on mobile. There's only tapping. So this interaction does not exist at all on a mobile platform, which is a lot of where websites are viewed nowadays. So you want to keep the important stuff in plain view. And if you're not sure where to put something, maybe you leave it off the website if it's not pertinent, because you don't want to clutter your space, but you also don't want to have to create very convoluted ways to get to your data. Then it's not a very easy to use website, which a personal website, like we discussed, should be really easy to use because it's mostly just people reading about you. People don't want to work to read. Think responsibly. Like I said just before, a lot of people view websites on many different platforms, and this includes desktop monitors, widescreen desktop monitors, laptops, tablets, and phones of many different sizes. So your websites should be responsive and designed with this in mind. They should be accessible, they should be easy to use, and a button should not be too small on mobile. It should not be, text should not be very difficult to read on your background, etc. And stick to your design language. Come up with a set of design principles beforehand and stick to those consistently throughout your website in order to avoid sort of a hodgepodge or less professional look. So let's talk about how to come up with that design language and what are some really great or really important things to look out for when you're coming up with the design language that's going to be used throughout your website. Color. Is it going to be a light or dark website? It could be both. Maybe that's a fun little feature you could put in, is have it toggle between a dark and light mode. The text should be readable. There's plenty of tools out there where you give it a hex code for text color and a hex code for background. It will tell you if it's accessible and readable. And you should try a few out. It's easy to store colors as variables and not hard code them. So you could swap out colors as you see fit. Try it, evolve it, maybe tweak them a little bit if something looks a little off in one place. Color theory, I don't know any of it. Most people don't. There's tons of color palette generators out there. Go get some inspiration, tweak a few colors, just pick some colors that you like. And if they look good to you, put them on the internet. Other people will probably think it looks good too. Fonts. Fonts are a lot more than just which typeface you pick. A typeface is what the name of the font is. Times New Roman is a typeface. Arial is a typeface. Comic Sans is typeface. So there's many different kinds. There's display fonts. There's handwriting fonts. There's sans serif. There's serif. But you want to pick a font that's appropriate for the situation. Titles, headers, and things like that are large can be display fonts or handwriting fonts, which are maybe a little bit more difficult to read or a bit more unusual. but body text should probably be a regular sans serif or serif font. And there's great resources out there to check common pairs of typefaces, and also Google Fonts is a great place to find free typefaces that you can use at any time, and you can click through. There's thousands of them on there. You'll find something you like. Color, make sure you're using appropriate color where is appropriate. Body text should probably not be some crazy outlandish color because it's distracting. But when you want to call attention to something like a link, change the color of your text. And then also the relative size and the flow of those sizes. Headers should be larger than subheaders, should be larger than bodies. And the spacing in between your text should be really easily legible, but close enough that you can tell when things are related. And this hierarchy should stay the same. You shouldn't use different size headers all over your website and different size body all over your website. It should be consistent. How can we design the website before we start creating it? Any tips on using Figma? I love Figma. It's a great design tool. It's free and web-based for anybody who hasn't heard of it. I'm not a Figma expert. All I know is that I can create little components and drag them around and resize them as though I were using like an Adobe product or something. So I would say just go play around, get used to it, design some stuff. It's the best way to learn. All right, let's talk about separators, borders, etc. So there's many different ways to separate content on a website. As you can see there is at the top, in the top left, you can have two sections which are just different colors. Contrasting colors do well to separate space. You could just have a line that separates, let's say, a header and the body. You could have a shadow to do the same thing. There's many different ways of achieving these effects. However, you want to keep them consistent. Don't separate one section from another with a line and then have the next one be a shadow and then the next one be a shadow and then the next one be different colors. Your sections should really be similar, and that design language should go across not just in huge sections in your document, but for other components like buttons and blocks of text. Your borders should also be consistent. If you have a border radius, keep it consistent. You don't want very round, very square things all together. It's better to stay consistent. Sometimes you might want a shadow to lift something up. Sometimes you might want a border. Just keep in mind that all of these things play off of each other. So you might not want to put a shadow on a shadow on a shadow. And when you have a shadow, you don't want them to be all different shadows because it looks like the light is coming from unnatural directions. So once again, make these decisions up front. Think about what kind of changes this makes to the overall feel of your website and decide what's best for you. Finally, there's white space. White space is pretty tricky. You can have not enough white space like you see on the left, or too much white space like you see on the right. Your text and the other content of your website shouldn't flow all the way out to the edges. There should be some sort of padding, bringing them in, but there shouldn't be too much that it's all squished. You want to keep the flow. Similarly, when you have text, buttons, headers, etc., you want them to be close enough together that you can tell that they are related, unlike what you see on the far right, but they shouldn't be too close that there's no breathing room like you see on the middle left. All right, now that we've talked about a few of the principles behind how to design a personal site and some of the tools that we prefer to use for creating a personal site, Sean's going to take over and do a live coding starting a Next.js project.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Cool. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, so let me readjust my windows a little bit so I can still see the chat. Yeah, so I saw a lot of people actually discussing about design and what tools to use for making a design. So the thing that I like to use is Figma. So for today's workshop on the live coding portion, I'll be making a super duper simple website. Essentially, it'll be 3 pages. I'll start a demo. So there'll be 3 pages and it'll come up to the home page and people can click about me, we'll give some super simple description, then it will go into the projects. So Of course, you can make your website more fancy, but the idea for this project, for this workshop, is to give you a sense of how to even start and where to go after this workshop. And keep in mind, everything I'm doing here is on Figma. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend having a look at Figma. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to start doing some coding. So I'm going to pull up a terminal. And for starting a Next.js application, there's a prerequisite that you're going to need, which is Node.js. So for people that do not know what Node.js is, it is a JavaScript runtime environment for your computer. So in the old times, you can't actually run JavaScript on your computer, only in the browser. But as time went on, people invented Node.js, which is a runtime, and you can start writing JS code as you would with any other code and interact with your system. So in our case, you want to install Node.js. To install it's really simple. Just Google Node.js and then have that installed. And for my case, I already have it installed, so we're good. And to actually start a next project, what you would do is you run the command npx create next app, and I will use the latest version of it, and I'll give it a name. In our case, I'll call it my personal website, and it will start installing some dependencies. So while it's installing, I'll just explain what dependencies are. They're essentially, well, like the word suggests, things that your project will depend on. So in our case, it will depend on React, React DOM, and also Next. And there's some dev dependencies that I'll explain later what they are as well. So once it is.
Do you think you could copy and paste in the command that you wrote into the chat, the npx create next app?
Sean, I got it.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
well, there's gonna be 2 copies of it. Yeah. So once your project is created, what we want to do is open up the project in your favorite text editor. I like to use VS Code. It is the one I have always been using, but there's tons of other different text editors you could be using. But in my case, I'll start up in VS Code, and I'll just agree to some things. So once your project is opened, you will be bombarded with a bunch of files. But the good news is you will not be touching a lot of these files. So I'll start with node modules. This is a huge folder that contains all the dependencies that your project has. So you can see there are tons of different dependencies in our case. But for our purpose and for 99% of people's projects, you will never edit anything in node modules. So this will be automatically generated once your project is created and someone installs it. And next up, I'll be going through some of the configuration files. And I'll start from least relevant to the things you'll be touching 99% of the time. So the first are these configuration files. So there's something called package.json and then package.lock.json. Package.json is where they'll have some information about your project, some scripts that you could run for your project. Dependencies are, again, the things your project will have to depend on for your project to work. And dev dependencies are things that during the dev time, those are the packages that will be needed. But during production, i.e. when you deploy your project to somewhere else, these things won't be installed on that server. Package lock is a much more comprehensive version of package.json. And again, this is a file you will never edit. So these are dependencies for your dependencies, and there contains a bunch of other configurations. This file is automatically generated again when you create a package, when you create a Node.js project. And in this case, we'll never touch this as well. You may do some changes, especially in the script portion, if you have different scripts that you want to run. And a little bit later, I'll show you how to run these scripts. The next is, well, next.config.js. So this is configurations for your next project. In our case, we'll just use the default. There isn't anything that we have to change. And getignore is files you will be ignoring. And ESLint is configurations for our linter. So a linter is a piece of software that checks your coding out to make sure everything is coherent and there is no like extra spaces and different kind of like indentations and stuff like that. So this will just keep all your code coherent In our case, it is defaulted to next configurations, and we'll just keep it as that. So these are most of the configuration files. The main ones that we'll be using and maybe editing is package.json and .ignore if there's anything you need to ignore. Cool. And then there are 3 folders. So again, I'll start from least relevant to the things you'll be working on the most. Public is, you notice there's some icons in here. So favicon is the little icon that you see on the Chrome tab or any browser you're using, the little icon that displays next to the tab. So by default, it is this little triangle, but obviously you probably want to change it to something a little bit more interesting. Versalda SVG is just a SVG file that comes pre-installed with Next. So SVG is a file format to describe vector graphics. In this case, it's just some default vector graphics, is including the projects. We won't be using this as well. Styles, pretty self-explanatory. This is where your styling will be. So for web projects, you'll be using CSS to describe your styling. And over here, there are some global styling that we see over here. And then there is a home.module.css. So this is a modular CSS file that contains some styling for the home page. And lastly is pages. So this is where you will be 99% of the time. In pages, you see there's something called API. So a next project, since it is server-side rendered, you can also use it as an API in conjunction with building as a website. For this workshop, we won't be taking advantage of this feature, but for your personal website, if you want to be super fancy, you can have an API, then it can return some routes. If anyone taking 309 or 258, well, actually 358, you probably understand what like HTTP requests are. So this is where you'll be if you want to make an API. So these files that start with the underscore. So for Next.js, there are some special files. By default, it comes with underscore app.js. So this is a file that you will specify how your project is rendered. By default, it just imports the global CSS file and then whatever component that needs to render and just returns it back. So this file we won't be touching too much, but we will be changing a little bit of it to allow for our navbar to be global across all components. Index.js is effectively the homepage. So this is what people will see as soon as they enter the project. And there are other special files that you can see. And if you're interested about where you can learn more about Next.js, the easiest place is to go on nextjs.org, since that is the official website. Cool. And to start our project, again, we'll pull up a terminal and we'll run the command npm run dev. And run the npm run dev, it will do some build using Webpack. You don't have to worry about what Webpack is. It is a love-hate relationship between me and Webpack. But in this case, you just have to think of it as a magic box that builds a project. So in our case, our project is compiled successfully. I am going to pull it up side to side so that we can see both. And it just has gone localhost 3000 to see a project. So this is the project that comes by default when you enter a Next application. So there will be some interesting buttons. Over here is FCG I mentioned. So if I go into index.js, that's where the Versalda SVG is. And this is where the favicon is. So just pretty like normal page telling you how do you write a page and stuff like that. And for our purpose today, I'm going to be deleting all of this. It may be scary thinking like, okay, he's deleting everything, but don't worry, we're going to be able to make this work. I won't be removing the app.js contents, but I'll be removing a lot of other files. So for our index, I'll be removing that. So now it's completely empty. It says the default export is not there anymore because I am not exporting anything, but don't worry, we'll fix that. I'll keep the favicon, but I'm going to remove the Versalda SVG since we won't be using that. In the styling, I will keep global.css, but I'm going to remove everything. Home.modules, I'll remove it for now. Cool. So now we have essentially a completely blank slate. So let's get coding. And the first thing I want to be able to do is display something on the home page when someone enters here. And to do that, you would start writing a function. So there are many ways to write functions in JavaScript. The ones that you guys are familiar with is function something, then return something. But in our case, I'll be using something called ES6 syntax, which includes something called the arrow syntax. It is essentially a newer version of JavaScript, and it's personal habits, but I will highly suggest learning this syntax for JavaScript. So in this case, I will make a function called home, and this will be a arrow function, and we'll just return back a div. And for those of you that worked with vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you're probably thinking like, what is he doing? How is he returning back HTML in freaking JS files? This seems illegal, right? But with React and in our case Next.js, this is what's called JSX. So you can combine HTML and also JS together. So right now this is still not working, and that is because I did not export it. So I'm just going to export default home. And then I'll give it a second to re-render, and now we have empty div. I'll just go and put home over here so something appears. And now we have a nice little home page. Cool. So this is fine and dandy, but I'm going to make a little bit of change to make my life easier, which is changing the extension to be JSX. So this tells the file that this is not a normal JavaScript file. This is a React JSX file. So I'll be mixing HTML and JS together. And what that allows me to do is just have a lot better auto completion. So now if I write div, it will just automatically auto complete for me rather than having to write the Angular syntax and stuff like that. Cool. So now that we have this, I'm going to rename this to JSX as well. We have this little home page. Okay, so if I hop back to the design real quick, get a little refresher, we're going to have 3 pages. We're going to have a home page, we're going to have a little about page, and we're going to have projects. And I understand that Aaron talked about how you scrolling is bigger than clicking around and also different tabs. But in this project, I want to show you as much as I can about Next. So I'll also be showing you how to switch different pages in the case that you do need to. So I'll start by building out 3 pages. The first is a home page. Then, so I'm just gonna quit Discord real quick. Cool. The home page, the about page, and the projects page, and make sure that routing is working. If I start with the styling, to make different pages is super simple in Next. You would simply create another JSX files inside of pages. So over here, I'm gonna create a file called about.jsx. And again, I'll write a function. I'll call this about is equal to arrow function, and I'll return back a div about. And lastly, remember to export. Cool. So now if I was going to the header, going to /about, it will go into the about page. So routing is finished. This may seem pretty self-explanatory with Next, but with React, if you're using React, you have to install some different packages, such as React Router. That's the most famous one. So that routing like this could work. Otherwise, you have to do some more configurations. But with Next, it's built in, so you don't have to worry about these things. Cool. So I'm going to make another page called projects.jsx. Again, I'll make a function for projects. Yeah, I'll call projects. And I'll return back a div, and it will just say projects. And now export default, now debug projects. And now I will just make sure that works as well. If I can spell English, that is projects. There we go. And now we have some nice pages. Okay, so this is cool, but we obviously don't want people to always type on the top so that they can navigate. So we're gonna start by building out some components. So the first part of the website, and for those of you that doesn't know what components are, you can think of them as almost they're reusable portions of the application. So in our case, we'll be reusing the navbar on each page. So we'll be building out that portion first. And to make a component, you will again be using a JSX file. And we won't be making the component in pages because it is not a page, it is a component. So I'm just gonna make a new folder called components, and I will call it navbar.jsx. Oh, cool. Okay. So for navbar.jsx, I will create a function again. So you guys are probably familiar with this now. And for now, I'll just return back a div, but we're gonna be doing a bit more with this component. Export default navbar. Okay. So now that we have this component, I mean, we're not displaying anywhere yet. To make sure that we're writing like correct code, for now, I am just going to go into our index, and I'm going to import it in. So like using Python or Java or any other kind of languages, you can export, import things throughout your projects. So in our case, we'll be importing navbar /component/ navbar. Yeah, we'll give it a second for this to resolve because it was very confused. Margin not found. This happens sometimes if you start creating new, what's it called, new folders. So you just want to restart your server so it registers. Okay. We'll give it a little bit more time to compile, and now we're good to go again. Okay, so now I have this navbar. Let's put it somewhere. And you're probably thinking, how do we do that? Well, navbar is a tag now, if I can spell correctly. So we can do something like this, and this will be our custom tag. So for those of you that came from a object-oriented background, this is kind of like almost like a class. You essentially the class and you put it inside another class. I prefer not to think about it that way. It is just a reusable piece of code that you can like use somewhere else. But now we'll have our own little tag. So there's nothing navbar yet. Let me just prove that it works by putting something in here. Navbar. And now we have navbar on our homepage. Okay, so this is pretty, not really, but let's actually make it look like the design we had in mind. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into navbar. Then I'm going to start making it a bit more like how our design is going to be. So the first is that this is not going to be a div tag, but a nav tag instead. And for the nav, we're going to have some different links that people can click on to go to different parts of the application. For links, you probably are thinking of the A tag, but because next is server-side rendered, we'll be using a tag that next provides for us. So in our case, the tag that's provided is called link, and you can import it from next/link. And don't worry, I don't remember all of these things. You can find all this information on nextjs.org. This is why all your profs tell you to read documentation, because it actually is a good idea, you know, like otherwise there is no way, like no one would ever remember all of these things. Okay, so to use a link tag, again, super duper simple. It is just a normal tag, and there are some attributes you want to pass in for it. So the first attribute I'm going to pass in is called href, similar to a tag. This is where the link would take you once you click on it. So I'm going to make this the home page. So this will be home, and I'll just copy out a few more. This will be the /about. I cannot spell English. /about page. And lastly, this will be projects. Okay, so now I have 3 links. Let's just verify it works. Home is good, about is good, project is good. And we immediately notice the issue. The nav only exists on the home page. Yeah, I mean, it's super like I guess, annoying solution would be to just copy this over each page, but obviously that's horrible. Since if you want to change the navbar, you have to change it for all of them. So instead, we'll be putting our navbar in the underscore app.jsx. So this actually controls how our app is rendered on each page. So like we talked about before, I'll be importing the navbar into here. So there is no specific conventions about the order of importing, but for me, I prefer to import styling after everything else. So I'm going to import navbar first. And once that is imported, instead of just returning the component, I'll be returning an empty tag, and then I'm going to put the navbar at the top. And okay, this is fine because I already put it here. That scared me for a second. I was like, where did that come from? Okay. Cool. So the empty tag is a special tag in React. Essentially, it just tells you that I want to surround something and contain it together, but I don't want it to be a div or anything like that. So empty tag just kind of like groups different tags together. And the thing about React is you actually have to group them together. So if you have it, so it's two separate things for it to render, it will actually complain and be like, hey, what are you doing? You need to be grouped in an empty tag or something else if you want to. So we actually have to do this. So I'm just going to fix it up. Let me refresh it real quick. And now we have our little navbar on every single page. It looks ugly, but it works. Okay, so one last portion of the navbar in terms of functionality is I want people to be able to click on my name and still be able to go back home. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a link. And then for the href portion, I'm going to, again, make it into home. And for this link, it is going to be a little bit special. So I'm going to put a tag inside of here. And I'll explain the reason why later. But for now, pass href. So essentially, this link tag will pass the href into the a tag here. And lastly, I'll put my name in here, showing who. This may seem redundant. You're probably thinking, like, what's the purpose of this? And the reason is for styling, because I will be styling this to look like this later. And by default, it is pretty difficult to be able to grab these a tag inside of a link tag. And if you ever want to see how these projects are rendered on your browser, what you could do is go into settings, more tools, and click on developer tools. So this is, I mean, if you guys played with this back when you're high school to change like stuff and say you're a hacker, I mean, now we're actually gonna be using it properly instead of saying you're a hacker person, but it kind of looks cool. You have a bunch of code next to it. So you can see this is actual HTML that's being rendered by Next. So we have a nav, we have a little div. At the very top, we have this body. And this inside the nav, you can see is all rendered into a tags. Pretty awesome. But if you want to see a bit more about like specific information for each portion, you click on this and you hover over it. And in our case, there's not much to do. It just gives you some sizing and stuff like that. But it is a pretty cool little tool for you. And if you're doing like personal website, it is any kind of web dev, the developer tool is a godsend. Okay, so in terms of functionality, the navbar has essentially achieved its job already. Now it's time to style. And to style the application, you will start writing some CSS. This workshop is not a CSS workshop, so I won't be going to a specific syntax for it, but I will try to explain as much as I could for each line of the CSS I'm writing. So I will start with some global styling. And by default, I don't really want any margins. So you see there's some spacing and stuff like that around my project. I don't really want that. So I'm just going to disable it. I will specify the body and I'll say padding is 0, margin is also 0. and that will disable a little spacing around the side. Okay, and the other thing that I'll be doing is that I'll be making my HTML, and then height will be 100%. And that will make sense a bit later as to why we want to do this. And the reason is, if we look at our design, we have a little background image at the back of someone writing down notes. Of course, you don't have to use this, but this is the one I'm going to go for. And to import images into your project, you would drag them into the public folder. So in our case, I have 2 images I'll be using, so I'm just going to put both of them in here for now. Okay, where did my browser go? One second. Okay, that was weird. All right, so now we have the images set up. We're going to be doing a little bit of styling with the navbar. So the first thing that I'll be doing is I'll create a new styles file. And in this case, I'll call it navbar module.css. And by specifying as a module, you just tell the JavaScript that this is something you're going to be importing, since we're going to import this into navbar later. In fact, I'll do that right now in case I forget later. So I'm going to import styles from styles/navbar.module.css. I think I spelled that correctly. Awesome. And we're going to start styling some stuff. Okay, so I'm going to have a class called navbar. So classes in CSS and are quite like what you think in object oriented. They're essentially groupings of stylings that you can apply across different tags, not so much as a class and you instantiate it or stuff like that. So for our navbar, the styling first is background color. I'm gonna give a very specific color over here. Is a shade of black that I like. That's the one I'll be using. You notice nothing is being applied. That is because I didn't even put the class over here. So let me just do that. So I'm going to put this on the nav tag, and to put a class on the tag, use a class name. And in our case, we will do styles.navbar. And now we'll have a black background. Very ugly right now, but I will fix that. Notice there's a little difference between the syntax. So over here, instead of using quotes to specify that as a string, I am using angle brackets. And the reason is because I'm inputting a JavaScript expression into here. So styles on navbar, this is not a string. This is actually a JavaScript import that I did. So to specify something as a JavaScript expression, you would use not angle brackets. You use curly brackets rather than the 2 quotes. Okay, so I'm going to keep on writing some styles. Again, I won't be too specific about what each one of them does, but you can probably guess. So first, I'll give it a height, 60 pixels, and then I'm going to give it a little bit of padding. So 0 pixel, 10 pixels. So this just says the height. So the y-axis will be 0 pixels, but in terms of the x-axis, it will be 10 pixels. Okay. And up next, I want to change some of the coloring. So you notice that right now, this is like ugly purple. So I'm going to, again, specify navbar. I'm going to capture the A tag. So this says everything inside the navbar, get the A tags. I'm going to first do text decoration is none, so that there is no this little ugly underline. And then I want to change all the colors to be white so that you can actually see it. Beautiful. Now we can actually see some stuff. I'm going to give each of the little links a little bit of padding just on the x-axis. And I'm going to also increase the font. So it's 20 pixels so you can actually like see it a bit better. Okay, so this is looking a lot nicer already. And now we're going to have to do some alignment. So you hear the classic tale of how do I align the div? Well, today I'm going to show you at least 2 ways to do it. The first is using flexbox. So I'm going to make the navbar a flexbox. And I'm going to just simply say align items center. And now it is centered in the middle. See, not as hard as people say online. Up next, if I go back into my Figma, we notice that the Sean Who portion pushes everything to the right, right? So it's separated like this. To do this is super duper simple. I'm gonna make a new class called logo link, and this will just be a class assigned only for this portion. Cool. And I am going to give this a silent called flex scroll 1. Notice nothing has happened yet because again, I haven't applied this to anything else. And this is where this portion comes in. So this allows me to put this inside. Oops, sorry. I need to put it as styles.logo link. And now everything is pushed to the right side. Flex scroll is a flexbox property that just defines how much space something will be taking up. If you want to learn more about it, just Google flexbox. It is a pretty interesting concept, and I think it's a must learn if you're doing any kind of web dev. Cool. So in our case, this is already looking a lot better. We have our navbar that looks like what it should look like. And now let's work a little bit on our homepage. So I'm going to go back to my Figma. The first thing on the homepage is that we want to put this image as a background. And actually, the image is a background for every single page. So to do that, this will be a global styling. I'm going to go back to global.css. Then I'm going to specify the background. So the reason I do min height is 100%. I'll explain a bit later. But as soon as I do this portion, I'll be able to better explain it. So firstly, I'll give it a background image. This image will exist in public, background JPEG. And I am going to say no repeat. So if you notice, this thing is being repeated like as many times as there is. I don't want that, so I'm just going to keep it as this. And the other issue is that it's not covering the entire page. No problem. I'll just say background dash size, and I'll give it a cover, and now it will cover the entire page. And you're probably thinking now, what is the purpose of this HTML 100%? So if I was to comment that out, you notice it doesn't cover the entire page. And the reason being, if I was to inspect the page, let's see, the head, body, yeah, HTML only covers the little top portion over here. So we want to make it the height for the entire thing so that then the background image, when we do background size cover, which covers entire containers in our case, it's the body. Now it will cover the entire page. Awesome. Okay, so now we have our background done. We're going to start working a little bit on the home page. So I'm going to close some files. I'm going to go into the home page, and for the home page, I don't need that anymore as well. I'm just going to pull up the Figma. Let me find it. 1 second. Okay, so for the home page, I have 3 main things. There is the text, a little smaller text, then a button. So to do this, I'm gonna start building some things for the home page. First, I have as a div, then I'm gonna have a h1 text. So h1 is just a heading, and this will say, hi, I'm Sean. And notice there is an error, and this is because I shouldn't be using this little the little quote over here due to some styling reasons. In my case, I won't actually fix this. I'm just going to disable this rule from the entire file, and I'll leave it as that for now. But you could listen to it and change it so it's instead the code rather than the little quote. So in our case, I just ignore. So I'm going to make another little sentence, student, engineer, streamer, and it'll be over here. Notice we can't see anything, and this is horrible. So since we're using dark mode for most of our project, I am going to actually specify a global color for our project as white. So I'll go color, white, and now all the text by default will be a white color, which is what we want. So we're good to go. Okay, cool. And lastly, we need this button. So if we go back to Figma, we notice the button is not the default button that comes with JSX. So what do? We have to build our own custom component again. So I'm going to go back to components. I'm not going to make a new folder. I'm going to make a new file called button.jsx. And inside of button.jsx, I will again pass button is equal to a function. And the function for now, I'll just return back the default button with no styling. Right? We'll be styling that a bit later. Oh, sorry, this should be lowercase. Okay, so I'll say click me for now, and I'll import it in our homepage so we can see it and start using it. Okay, components / button, and I'll just put the button right smack here. Okay, so it is getting a little bit confused as well. Oh, actually, I forgot to export. My bad. Export button. Okay, so now I have this button that does absolutely nothing, which is completely fine. We'll be making some changes to that. Alrighty, so let's do some more styling. From the page design, there is a white border. It is a square size and is relatively big. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll make a new style file. I'll call it button.module.css, and I'll start writing some CSS for it. For the class, I will call it custom. Oh, my keyboard just lagged out there. That was weird. I'll call it custom button. And let me go into my button.jsx, and I'll import the styling from styles / button.module.css. Okay. And I'll put this on the button. Class name is equal to, remember, we want to use the curly brackets because we're using a JavaScript expression. And I'll just call it custom button. Cool. And I'll just give it some styling. So the first thing is the background color of, again, the specialized little shade of black I like to use. And now our button is black and we can't see anything. So let's make the font color into white so we can actually see some stuff. I'm going to remove the shadows from it since we don't really want that. So I'm going to give it a border first of 2 pixels solid white border. And for CSS, you notice there are a lot of like English essentially. So this is pretty self-explanatory. It is 2 pixels thick. It is a solid line. You can also have something like dashed, for example, then it'll be a dash line, then it'll be a white color. And CSS there isn't any special syntax for it. It's just essentially this curly bracket, then you can specify a class. Cool. And I am going to give it a width of 220 pixels. So it's a lot bigger. And the height of 70 pixels. Cool. And let's increase the font size as well so that people can actually see what we're writing. Awesome. Now we have this little nice button. And for just a little touch, I'm going to make the cursor a pointer. So now when I hover over it, it becomes this little finger to specify as clickable. Okay, so that's pretty much all the styling I'll do on the button. You can do more things like hover animations, click animations, but for our purpose, this is sufficient. Okay, so now we have another problem. So this button will always say click me, which is bad because I want to reuse this in other things, right? For our case, we're going to use something called props. So props are short for properties. They're essentially things that your function will accept as a parameter, then you can inject them into your code. So you can think of this just function parameters. And in the object-oriented case, it will be your initializer, then you shove in like properties, attributes into your initializer so that you can specify different attributes for each instance of a class. Kind of similar over here. So for our button class, we're gonna have we're going to have a path to specify the path of what happens when you click on the button. Then we're going to have a special attribute called children. So what children is when you're passing in something between the tag, that thing will be designated as a children. And you notice that over here, this is actually a object. So objects in JavaScript is not really the same sense as objects in object-oriented case. It is more similar to a dictionary in Python. So just a key value pair. Over here, you see there is actually no key value. And the reason is this is a short syntax. So what happens is that when the button component is initialized and using another component, it will pass in all the attributes that it needs, all the props it needs into a singular object. And by using this syntax, it will actually deconstruct it. So we can think of it as the only attribute that the button will receive is something called props. And to use any kind of things, you do props.path or props.children. And you can use that throughout any type of the code. But rather than doing props dot all the time, I would just destructure at the very top so that we can use it just by calling path with children rather than having to type props every time. Okay, so for the children, this will be a customized text that people can put as the text for the button. So again, I'll use a curly bracket over here because I'm putting a JavaScript expression. So I'll put children over here, and I'll give it a default value as well of click me, just so if you instantiate a button without passing anything, it would just say click me. For the path, this is where the interesting part will come. So we will be using the path when something happens and someone clicks on the button, and then it will trigger a path change. So for now, I will not be doing that part. Instead, I'll make sure that the props actually work. So on the home page, we're going to have a button called about. So in this case, we're good to go. And then for the button, we're going to be passing the path of the about page. So what's a prop exactly? Right. So props are essentially properties that you can pass into a component to specify different things for it once you're like calling it as a tag. So in our case, we want to use the button in different places, right? We don't want to have it just be static and always say click me. And properties are where you can pass in so that it knows, okay, so in our case, we want to change the property to be about because that's what I pass in as a prop. But it just essentially, if you're thinking about in your object-oriented case, it is just a class attribute. So when you instantiate a class, you'll be passing different attributes for your object to make it like do whatever it needs to do. And that's what props are in React as well. So you can change the components. In this case, we're passing the props children, and the children will be the about text. Okay, so the other prop I'll be passing in is the path. And the path in our case will be about. So that will go into about. And let's see if it works right now. It doesn't because I haven't used path yet. And we're going to be using something called a hook. So hook is essentially it's a reusable piece of code that allows you to have React, different React functionalities and tap into React states and rendering cycles in the functional component. So in just a normal function. Next provides us with a hook called use router that allows us to route different things. So this is the hook we'll be using so that we can change the pages on click. And I'll import the use router. And to start using this router, first you will be in the function, you kind of instantiate it. And I'll say const router is equal to use router. And now router is a function that allows us to change different pages. So you can think of use router just a special function that allows you to tap into React states, React cycles, rendering cycles, and stuff like that. For the button, I'll be passing a special prop on click. So pretty self-explanatory what happens when you click on something. And when something is clicked, I want it to execute the function of router dot push whatever path the user passed in. So this will cause a page change every time when the button is clicked. So to make sure that works, I click on the About page and we push this so that they'll enter the About page. Awesome. Okay, so in terms of functionality, we're good to go. We just have a little bit more styling to make this into a centered middle. And to do that, I will create a new style. I'll call this home.module.css. And I'll start making some CSS files. And I'll make this a class of home. And first, I will make the text align to the center so that everything is centered in the middle. I'm going to do a little bit of a hack over here so that it takes up the entire page. And this little piece of code allows us to have the home page takes up the entire portion underneath the navbar so that then we can center it directly in the middle over here. And we're going to use flexbox again. We'll display 0 to flex. For the flex direction, in our case, we're going to make this a column. So it's like this. And we're going to justify the content so that everything is centered. Let me import the styling so we can see the changes as we code. /index.home.module.css, and I'll just put this over here. This will equal to styles.home, and give a second. Okay, so we can see everything is centered nicely except for the button. Lastly, I'll just put a line item center as well so that it is centered vertically. Cool. So this is already looking a lot like our design, but I'll just have a bit more CSS to match it. First, I'll increase the font size for 60 pixels for this H tag, and I'll give it a margin of 0 since it's pushing some stuff down there. Next up, I'll be giving a little bit of CSS to the P tag font size, if I could spell. Font size will be 20 pixels, and the margin at the bottom, I'll give it 60 pixel margin so that pushes it down a bit lower. Okay, cool. So our About page is done. That is pretty awesome. And let's go into, oh, sorry, our home page is done. Let's start working a little bit on our About page. So I'm gonna go a little bit faster since I think we're running a little out of time. Actually, we're already over time, so I don't want to keep you guys here for too long. But essentially, I'm gonna make another CSS file and start styling the About page a little bit. So for the About page, I have a div, and then I have H1 tag again. And I'll say student engineer streamer, and I have a P tag, oops, with some descriptions about myself. So I'm going to copy over a description about myself, and you notice there's breaks so that we can like break between. And lastly, it has a button as well. And for the button, it says projects. And this is where our props comes in, because now I can just specify different things about the buttons, but not having to rewrite the entire component. And let me actually import buttons as well, so it will work. Import button from /component/button. Okay, so we have a rough like outline of what it look like. I just have a little bit of styling so that it can be centered. So I'll say it's about, and let me import the styles as well. Import styles from /. style slash about module.css. And then I'll just give it a little bit of styling. Again, I'll use the hack that I wrote before to have it fill up the entire page over here, rather than just having the whatever it needs. So it'll be 100 vertical height minus 60 pixels. And I'm going to display the flex again. Oops. So I can start centering things. The flex direction will be a column, since I want it to be vertical. I will justify the content to be centered, and I'll align the content to be centered as well, so everything is in the middle. Give it a second to re-render. There we go. Let me put this over here. Files.about. Cool. So now that's over here. This is not as I wanted, so I'm gonna give a little styling to the h1 tag as well, so it's a little bit to the right. Cool. And I'll text align this to be the start, so it's not at the beginning. And I am going to also increase the font size to be 40 pixels. I'm not going to give it a margin, but I am going to make the width of it equal to 100%, so it takes up the entire width. And the padding on the left, I'll give it 25%. So it's about a quarter of the way on the page. Cool. And for the about page, I'm gonna, again, do box sizing. Box sizing is used so that you can specify the width, including the margins. It's a little hack that you can use as well. In this case, I'll give a font size of 70 pixels, a little padding, a margin on the bottom of 50 pixels. I'll give a little padding as well, actually the exact same as what I gave to the headings, so 25%. And I'll give the width of 100% as well. Cool. So now everything is centered nicely again. I know I'm going through this pretty fast, but we're gonna have to deploy pretty soon. Aaron, should I go through the projects page as well? Because there's still quite a little bit.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's just creating more components and pages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think for the projects page, just so that we don't drag this workshop on for too long, I won't be going through it. But
We could link the repo.
Code, yeah, all the source code I'll be writing is like over there as well. Yeah, for sure. I'll link the repo as well. But yeah, so essentially that is how you make a website. And up next, Aaron will be showing you how to deploy this so that you can actually show it to people rather than just having it locally.
Yeah, all right. I'm gonna take over the screen share, and then we're going to talk a little bit about deployment options. So there you go. So it was mentioned before, isn't it going to cost money to deploy my website? I mean, don't you need a server? And yeah, that's true. You need a place to go to on the internet and a computer that's connected to a web address to serve the documents. But luckily, there are multiple options available to us for websites that are as small and simple as the ones that we're talking about here. Since you're going to be receiving relatively low traffic and also very few builds, very infrequent builds of very small sites, there are a number of options that have free hosting tiers for websites like this. They include Heroku, GitHub Pages, and Netlify, just to name some that I personally have used before. Vercel, the people who make Next.js, also have a really great deployment platform for Next apps. But today, I'm just going to show you really quickly a little tour of Netlify because it's my preferred way of deploying static sites, especially Next sites. So if we go over This is the GitHub repository for the completed version of the website that Sean was just walking through the creation of. And all I've done is I've forked this repository so that it's as if it were my own. So all you have to do is go to netlify.com, create an account, log in, and you'll be taken to the dashboard. Now you can see I already have not only my own personal website, but a few other different projects that I've worked on in the past. So this is what the dashboard looks like for a project that already exists. This is my website. But what we're going to do is we're going to create the new site from Git button. Click the new site from Git button. We're on GitHub, but you can choose whatever Git provider you use. And it will ask you to log in. It will authorize you. And then you can select from a list of different Git repos, whatever you'd like to deploy. So I'm just going to take my personal website, which is the thing that Sean just showed you. We're going to pick a branch to deploy. Now, what you have to keep in mind is this is something called continuous deployment, or CD, which means that every time that you make a commit and push it to the branch in your GitHub repository, Netlify will be automatically notified of this change and then create a new build of your website with the information that was just pushed to GitHub. And you could do that on whatever branch you'd like. So in this case, we're just going to do master. So we saw the Among Us thing, yeah. All right, so we can specify our build command, which Sean, is it just run build? What? Let's go find out. Package JSON. Next build. It is npm. Yeah. So npm run build, and then
just npm run build.
Yep. And then deploy site. Should be it. So now we can actually watch the site deploy and read the logs and see what Next is actually doing. All right, so it's downloading everything from Git. It has it all now. And now it's starting to install all the NPM modules. Those are the things that were specified inside of our dependencies in our package JSON. And it knows not to install the dev dependencies because we don't need them anymore. Those were just for writing code, and now we're deploying. All right, so now it's running a build. You can see that it knows exactly how to deploy our site just based on giving it the Git repository and telling it what command to run to run a build. All right, so it tells us that our directory is opt build repo, and now we're building. So it's creating a production build, which will actually take the React that we had and turn it into HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript. Yeah, so it's not necessarily fully static. Next has a lot of different options available to you, such as statically generated, statically rendered, or server-side rendered rather. So statically generated is when you, and it tells you what it's done with every page. So let's go through these. Server-side render at runtime is anything with a lambda next to it, and it identifies all of this for you automatically if you've written the code. So server-side render is not quite static generation. What happens is that the server actually renders the page when the request is made in real time, and then sends all the static files. So instead of rendering and running the JS in your browser, it's done on the server because presumably the server is more powerful, has more bandwidth, and then the static files are sent down. A automatically generated SSG is a page that is generated automatically from a template using data that's pulled down at build time. So there are special kinds of functions called useStaticProps and useStaticPath paths, which are next built-in functions, which will do any sort of computation and then generate pages based on the computations that it's done. So if you want to pull down data or you have a blog post somewhere, that you want to put into a nice page, or any number of them, you can do that. And that's all generated at build time. And then the empty circle, as you can see, we have here under about 404 projects, etc., is a static page that's generated entirely HTML and CSS on the server and sent as static files, and they're generated once at build time. All right, so there's been no errors. You'll see all that here if that's the case. It's deploying and the deployment is complete. So we can now go to the URL that it gives us. It generates some random URL, and we can see and click around the website that we just made. And you could hook up a different domain by going to your domain settings and giving it a domain that you already own. It handles all the DNS and things like that for you. And it's entirely free forever for a project of this size with this functionality. Yeah, absolutely. People can totally visit this website. It is live on the internet, can be accessed by anybody who's connected to the World Wide Web. And then there's other deployment options like GitHub Pages or Heroku. Can we purchase domains? Yeah, so you could purchase whatever domain you want and hook it up to this. Once you own the domain, you just you go to the domain settings in your Netlify, say add a custom domain, and it'll walk you through it. It'll allow you to it'll help you purchase a domain if you don't own it, and if you own it, it'll help you transfer it. Yeah, GitHub Pages is a deployment platform made by GitHub. It's integrated right into GitHub. It is quite nice, but I have had a few issues with it in the past. It's a little bit more general, I think, than Netlify for this scenario. I use Netlify just because it's plug and play. You get to just give it any old project like that, and it'll handle all of it for you. There's essentially zero setup. GitHub Pages is perfectly good. If you have a GitHub account, you get a page. And it will essentially just create a website from whatever is in your a Git repo that you set up a page for. I'd go to the GitHub docs and check it out. It's changed a lot since the last time I've used it, because Microsoft bought GitHub, they introduced actions, whole thing. But it's really cool. I would get into it if you're interested in the GitHub ecosystem, but this is my preferred way of deploying. All right, I see that I'm not getting any questions, so I'm assuming that everybody understands how to use the Netlify. Are GitHub pages hard to make? No, they're not. I made it seem like they're harder to make than they are. They just they're just different. It used to be a little weird. I don't know how it is anymore. Yeah, you could just put markdown files into a Git repo and create a page out of it, and it will generate a website for you, I think. So there's many different things that GitHub Pages can do, including host static sites. But this is just super tailored to this kind of project, a static site generator made in React. As you can see, I literally had to do nothing. I just had to say which repo it is, and it deployed it for me. Yeah, exactly. Netlify is great. And it also has things like analytics that you can use. You have to pay for them now. Right. So that is how to deploy the personal site. If there are any questions for me or for Sean about anything in this talk, we'd be glad to answer them. And also, you could find us on the MCSS Discord and many other places to continue to ask questions as long as you'd like. Thoughts on Tailwind? I like Tailwind. I think Tailwind's really cool. I think that you have to get used to it, and there's ways to use it well and ways to use it poorly. In general, I like to stay away from pre-built CSS stuff because I think that it coaxes me into writing websites that look like everybody else's website. So I don't like using things like Bootstrap. But I think Tailwind is actually a really good iteration because it gives you a lot of flexibility and very few built out components, and just reduces code writing. It's good, but definitely takes some learning. Yeah, I think Next.js would be great for a course website because you're only updating it on your end. You could tie it into a content management system if you want, or just the way that I did it for my website when I had a blog was that I had markdown files, and whenever I had a markdown file, I just had Next take the data from markdown, parse it, put it into an HTML template or a React template, build that and deploy it. So yeah, if there's something that requires not too much interaction, like a course website, I think that Next would be great. Yeah, so not much of the coding, as you've noticed, is Next. Next has very few code features that it adds for the user. Those are more if you want to take more control of the routing and do more in-depth stuff there. Do more about static site, about server-side rendering or page generation, things like that. But this website, where all of the content is just put into standard pages and components, Next handles everything behind the scenes. So routing and build and deploy, bundling, everything Next does without you needing to intervene at all, because we just used the default things that Next provides. There is code that you can write for Next and settings and things that you can change, but it's not necessary for something like this. All right, I think that we're good to call it there. The video will be on the MCSS YouTube channel. And we're really looking forward to seeing what you guys make, personal sites that come out of this, personal sites that come up in the future. We're going to start an initiative, the MCSS, to share personal sites. So yeah, please send it on the Discord for everybody to look at and for us to keep tabs on it in the future so that we can add it to our collection of student personal sites. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. This was great. The recording will be on the YouTube channel.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah. I'm so used to at the end of these reminding people to submit their tutorial handouts by the next tutorial. I was about to tell everybody, don't forget to submit your tutorial handout by the next tutorial for your participation mark.
Yes, that is required.
Sir.
I'm just gonna stop the recording.
Yeah.